through, if any of you have some thought comes to your mind, and you have some good ideas, be sure to bring it up after. And we got to verse 16, I believe, chapter 8, verse 16, and two plagues have come, the frogs and the blood, and now in verse 16, plague 3, and you might remember I mentioned that when the third and sixth and ninth plagues come, no warning is given. In verse 16, and the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out thy rod, and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And according to history, the Egyptians had a desert god. And when it talks about the dust of the land, apparently referring to sand, and apart from the Nile Delta and the Nile River Valley, Egypt is, a lot of it is desert. And apparently there was a desert god, and so the fact that the sand or the dust of the land would be turning into lice would be defeat on the desert god. And in the Egyptian religion, the priests were extremely fastidious about keeping clean. And apparently they would wash, maybe even several times a day. They would shave their bodies, and to have lice on them would make them unclean to go to their temple and worship. And I hadn't noticed it before, but I should have, but it speaks about lice on the animals too. And so when they were sacrificing some animal to the god, it would be unclean also because of the lice on that animal. Anyway, that's the third plague. And again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Then in verse 20, we have plague 4. And this time, according to the pattern, God is using Moses and Aaron to warn Pharaoh. So let's play plague 4. He's being warned, verse 20. And the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the river. And apparently going to the river was a religious ritual. And even when the princesses come to the river, they think probably it's to do with their religion. Maybe they would, well, actually it says she bathed in the river. Maybe Pharaoh did too. And so apparently it was part of their religion. And I'm sure when Pharaoh came to the river to bathe and saw Moses and Aaron there, he wasn't too impressed. Anyway, God says, when you see him, lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, thus saith the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and upon thy houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I guess we all know that there are some flies quite vicious. I know as a child we lived on a farm, and sometimes you could get bitten by a horse fly. And did you have horse flies down your end? Yeah. And if you're a little kid, it wasn't, there were worse bites, but it wasn't very nice getting bitten by a horse fly. And you hear about people in Ontario having black flies, and there are different kinds of flies, and so flies could be very not nice to have at all. And so plague 4, flies. But there's something different about plague 4. And now God is going to make a difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And we see that beginning of verse 22. And I will sever or separate in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell. And when Joseph's father Jacob and his brothers and their families came to Egypt, they were given the land of Goshen, which apparently was a very fertile part of the land in Egypt. And so they're living in Goshen. And God says, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Now put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And the Lord did so, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, and into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. And the land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. And so as we go through the plagues, we can see the increase in intensity. And the flies and the lice and the water turning to blood would be all very unpleasant. But now it increases in the effect that only the Egyptians get this plague. And in verse 25, Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, Go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And notice he says, in the land. And God has told them, asked to leave a 3 days journey. But Pharaoh says, you can sacrifice, but in the land. And in spiritual meaning, the land of Egypt is a picture of the godless world. And God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt is a picture of our salvation from the godless world. And so when Pharaoh says, yes, you can go and have your religious ceremony, but stay right here in Egypt, stay right here in the world. And it's interesting, we can learn the different compromises that Satan makes to us, or sinful people may make to us. And so compromise 1, yes, you can sacrifice, you can have your religious ceremony, but stay right here in Egypt, in the world. And that can be a temptation to the one who's thinking becoming a Christian. And the devil may say to them, yes, you can become a Christian, but don't worry about leaving the world. And in fact, it's sad to say there's a growing group, some of the grace teachers, we know a little bit about them, and one of them actually told me, said, it makes no difference how you live. You can sin or not sin, it makes no difference. As long as you pray to receive Christ, we're under grace. Another person, kind of a similar group, told me, a few years ago, he said, we're so under grace that God doesn't even know we sin. And so people believe that God doesn't even know we sin, or if we think it doesn't matter how we live, well, why not go and sin? Many of them would say. And the Bible does teach that we're not saved, of course. You know that, I know. We're not saved by our works. But if we really are saved, there will be some changes, won't there? And our changed behavior is not the cause of salvation, but the results of salvation. There's a little chorus we used to sing years ago when we lived up north, a little children's chorus, and it was something like, when I met Jesus, I'm changed now. I met Jesus, I'm changed. And just a little children's chorus, but it is true. If we really have found Christ, there will be changes. Now, I know all of you are brought up in Christian homes, and so when someone in a Christian home gets saved, there may not be the huge change, that there would be someone in an ungodly home, but there will be changes. And so those who teach that it doesn't matter how we live after we're saved or after trusting God are actually falling for the compromise that the devil offered through Pharaoh to the Israelites. Anyway, Moses objects. In verse 26, Moses says, it is not meet, it would be not appropriate or good for us to do this. He gives the reason. For we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. In other words, we might sacrifice an animal that is considered unclean or bad to the Egyptians. For example, if you sacrificed a cow in India, the Hindus would think that was pretty bad because cows are sacred in India. Or to an Israelite, to sacrifice a pig on an altar as part of their sacrifice, that would be an abomination to the Jews. And Moses is saying if we sacrifice their certain animals, if we sacrifice them, the Egyptians will be very upset, and there might be a riot or there might be big trouble, and so we better not do it. That's the reason he gives. He says, if we did that, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? We will go 3 days journey to the wilderness, and sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he shall command us. And I don't think they're planning to come back. I think they're planning to just keep on going. But anyway, he's saying we want to go at least 3 days journey. And then in verse 28, Pharaoh gives the second offer of compromise. Verse 28, and Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only ye shall not go very far away. Does that ring a bell? You be a Christian, but don't be fanatical. I'm sure we've all met people like that. Yes, you can be a Christian, but don't bother other people about it. Don't witness to people. And the idea of going to church regular, that's probably a bit much, They'll go Christmas and New Year's and maybe the odd time in between, but the idea of being a regular, that's a bit extreme. And the Bible's okay when you're in trouble and sorrow and need some comfort, get the Bible out. But the idea of having to read it, regularly, that's a little bit extreme. And giving generously to the Lord, that's very extreme, you use all that money for yourself. And so certainly that's probably a temptation to many people. Yes, be a Christian, but don't go to extremes. Don't go too far with it. And that's the compromise that Moses is saying, or rather Pharaoh is saying to Moses, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God, only ye shall not go very far away. Don't be a fanatic about it. And then he says, entreat from me. In other words, he's saying, pray for me. And even though he's hardening his heart, at least he seems to realize that Moses' prayers have power, and the implication, there must be God he's praying to. And then Moses answers in verse 29. And Moses said, behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord. In other words, I will pray, I will entreat the Lord, that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants and from his people, tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully any more, in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And of course, we see over and over that Pharaoh makes false promises. Over and over, I'll let you go, I'll let you go, I'll let you go. And sometimes people have made promises like that to the Lord. And maybe an unsaved person is in big trouble. We all have big trouble sometimes. This person, Lord, if you just get me through this cancer and let me live and get better, I'll serve you. Or, Lord, I sure like that pretty girl. if you let me marry that girl, I'll serve you the rest of my life. Or, Lord, if you help me get that nice job I want, and make some good money, then I'll start going to church and I'll start serving the Lord. And it's interesting that even though these things happened 3,500 years ago, man is the same and the devil is the same, isn't he? And so we have the same temptations. You can serve God, but just stay in the world. Don't worry about your behavior. Or you can go a little bit further, but don't go too far with it. Don't go too far away. And that may be a good stopping place tonight, but in the next few chapters, we see compromise 3 and compromise 4. And they apply today just as much as back then. Now, any of you notice something as you went through? I know you have some good ideas, so I'd like to hear some of your ideas.
When it talks about going 3 days journey, kind of a picture of salvation, or I guess Jesus' burial, 3 days in the grave or whatever.
Right. I was even thinking the 3, you know, when the plagues came in, you know, 2 plagues warned, and then the third one not. I thought, well, when I think of 3, number 1, I think of the Trinity. I guess we think number 1 of that. But that's a good point. Anybody else?
Jen was always talking about the parallel to Revelation, the plagues that are to come in the time, and flies being, you know, one.
Right, yeah.
Just this, we have flies at the farm, and I think they're worse with the livestock around and stuff, but she just said her sister told her that there's a ban now on these fly traps coming, because they're the sticky traps that you unroll and you
I remember that, yeah.
They're banning them by, I think, the end of this year maybe or something, because they are cruel to.
Oh, for goodness.
So we should all stock up.
Yes. Well, a warning that you should stock up, but also a sign of the times that man holds animals and whatever in high esteem. But it's ironic that God's gonna what people build up and hold up in high esteem, he's gonna use
exactly
in punishment of.
And that's what God says. He calls like the flies and all the bugs his armies, and that's what you see with Egypt and in Revelation.
Yeah, right.
Everything that man worships is God's army. That's what he's going to use to punish them.
Right. That is incredible. I remember as a child that we would hang up this fly stickers in the house.
We still do. It's the only thing that works.
And
letting the dog in and out.
And we had quite a few flies on a farm in the summertime, and as a few days would go by, get blacker and blacker, and there'd be quite a few flies. I hadn't heard that, but it is sad. People, they're fussing more about animals, and of course, even I think, well, there's complaint about eating meat, isn't there? Well, that's cruel. You're killing animals, and that's very, very cruel to do that. And more and more, and you hear, I'm sure you've heard too, I think we all have, that maybe there's some important industrial project wants to get started, and maybe a pipeline, and you can't build a pipeline through the forest because there's some birds here that it would displace them. No, I'm fine with conservation, but usually be one little group, but maybe one little group is affected. We don't want to destroy the whole species, but it's often one little group, and can't do this, can't do that because of.
It seems like all the animals or the insects or whatever that are in the plagues are specifically what the environmentalists are trying to protect now as a species. Right. I think of another one, halfway to home, they did a big solar project here in the last year and a half.
Oh yeah.
And it's like 300 acres of good farmland that they want to put solar panels on, because the solar is supposed to be the green fuel of the future.
Yeah.
But ironically, the green project got held up by the environmentalists because they found these frogs and they had to do this big environmental study, so then the field was rolling and all the low spots, they've got tarps around and they weren't allowed to develop any of the solar panels in there. So it's so bad that the environmental people are fighting their environmental people on their own projects. It's just a schmoz,
Yeah, it's a sad world.
but they all line up with the specifically,
Yeah.
seems like the animals that were, insects that are in the plagues.
It's a good and sad point that people care more about the animals than they do about God, you know. And I think any thinking Christian, we don't want to pollute the earth. We want to take reasonable care of it, but the key is reasonable, you know. What's reasonable, you know. And really, according to the Bible, man does come first, man's needs, and what we can do for other men would come above the animals, like God gave
Charge
Adam authority over the animals, and basically Adam was given responsibility, and he can make decisions, you know, for our use, mankind's use. How about having one more Christmas song before we end? Got another one there, Chris?
Does anybody know number 12?
We can learn it.
Hmm?
We can learn it if we don't know.
Yes. Oh, that's the plan. It doesn't matter if you know it or not.
Well, if there's.
We'll learn it. Does anybody know it though?
I don't think so.
I don't recall, but that doesn't mean I haven't
Well,
heard the tune.
Emily and I do because it's big in orchestral.
Yeah, how about
circles.
teaching us, Chris? I've heard it,
I'm
but I don't know
not
it very
sure
well.
if I can play it or not. I haven't practiced. I can sing it through once, and then we could all join in on the second verse. Yeah, turn that off. I don't want my voice on there.
Or are you gonna grab your